And now, Pastor Eddie will bring us our word today.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Okay. It's looking better. It's looking better. Got a few more today. That's how we want to do it. Just a few more every Sunday till we get to where the place is full. Right? I printed off 40 of those little bulletin things you got, so I want to get to where we give out all of those. And how many we got left, Tom? Oh, Tom's gone. Don's gone. So he's over there counting money. But we'll let him do that. We'll want to make sure we give all those out. I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm glad you're here. This is March the 10th. So last Sunday was Mike. This Sunday and the next two are me, and then Mike again. This is February the 10th. I saw my wife telling me that, but I didn't pay any attention to it, but I should have. Which usually happens when I don't pay any attention. The old devout cowboy came in from the range and noticed he had lost his favorite Bible while he was mending fences out on the range. And 3 weeks later, a cow walked up to him and had his Bible in its mouth. And the cowboy, he couldn't believe his eyes. He took the Bible out of the cow's mouth, raised his eyes heavenward, and claimed, "It's a miracle." "Not really," said the cow. "Your name was written on the inside front cover." Okay. Sometimes I do better than that, and sometimes I don't. Sometimes that's about the best you get, but anyway. That's right. That's right. When the sun comes out, it gets better. Today we want to start a series of messages on worship. Sometimes I wonder if we really know what the word worship means. And I'm sure we all have our different ideas, but worship really is from an Old English word, which is worthship, meaning that it carries the meaning of being worthy. If we worship something, then we're saying that it's worthy of our praise, worthy of our reverence, and therefore it's worthy of our worship, our worship. Charles Stanley, pastor at First Baptist Atlanta for many years, once said that he believed that most Christians in most churches have never worshiped God. We go to church, but we don't worship. We sing songs, but we don't worship. We listen to sermons, but we don't worship. All of these things I mentioned are elements of worship, but they are not worship in and of themselves, which means that you can do all of them, and yet you fail to truly worship God. We Christians often mistake the means of worship for worship itself. I was intrigued about a story about a man who his son was having his 6th birthday. And this young boy was very, very organized. And he was very, very specific with his mom and dad about what he wanted for his birthday. So since his father knew this, the dad went to him and asked him, "What would you like for me to get you for your birthday?" And he expected a well-planned reply, such as, "Well, Dad, I like a baseball glove. You can find it at Toys R Us, aisle 6, shelf 2, below the batting helmets. Or a Parcheesi board. The games are in alphabetical order in their section. You won't have any trouble finding it. It's on aisle I. It's between the Pac-Man and the Payday. Parcheesi, between Pac-Man and Payday." But this year, the son's request was a little different. He says, Dad, I'd like a ball to play with for my birthday. And the dad asked, great, what kind of ball? I don't know, either a football or a soccer ball. And the dad said, well, which would you want more? And the son said this, if you have some time to play ball with me this year, I'd really like a football so we could throw it back and forth in the yard. But if you're going to be real busy like last year, maybe you could just get me a soccer ball because I can play soccer with the other kids in the neighborhood. The dad thought about this a moment and he said, well, son, let me surprise you. How will that be? Dad was, okay, Dad, that'll be great. I love you. That'll be really great. And then he went in and told his wife, shared that little encounter with their son, and they agreed one thing. Their son was not so much interested in the gift as he was in the giver of the gift. True worship is not interested in the created, but the creator. Questions like, well, did you like the sermon this week? How about the music? Those are the wrong kind of questions, folks. hate to break that to you. After many of you have been sitting in here for years and years and years, but the right question would be, did God like the music this morning? Did God approve of the message that the pastor delivered? While I'm shaming you, let me add one more thing. Christians also make the mistake of limiting their worship to 1 hour each week. And when they come to that service, they often come to observe and be entertained. I've been at services, folks, and I'm sure you have too, that were open with the following statement. We want you just to sit back, relax, and enjoy the worship today, and enjoy the program we have prepared for you. If the people feel that they were entertained, they say they had a good worship service. If they feel like they weren't very entertained and they didn't like it very much, probably won't be back. You see, what I'm trying to tell you is that we've gotten this idea of worship backwards. We think that the pastor and the worship leaders, Ray and Mike and Mark and the ladies that sang, we think that we got this feeling that they are the performers and we are the audience. And they're up here doing what they're doing for us. But actually, in true worship, we're the performers. We're the performers. You're the performers. Director, director, director. Director. We're the directors. Who's the audience? God is the audience. God is the one who's listening. God is the one who is receiving what we offer up to Him. And if we're truly going to worship, we got to come to worship the one whom we should worship. It's for God. This worship service is not for us. I hate to say this to you, but there's not one person in this room today, including yours truly, not one of us is worthy of worship. But God is. God is worthy of our worship. God is worthy of our praise. And we got to learn to address our worship to Him. We got to learn how to worship Him. Now, the word worship appears in the Bible for the first time in Genesis chapter 22. Did you realize that? Genesis 22, verse 5. It's the first mention of the word worship in Scripture. And what we're going to do, and this is going to be very familiar to you, this is a story about, in Genesis 22, this is where Abraham is told by God to take his son, his only son, Isaac, and sacrifice him on Mount Moriah to God. Wow. I tell you what, folks, some of you in this room have lost children. And there is no greater loss in this life than losing a child. Just think of that. And yet, here's Abraham with a child that was promised to him, and this child was going to be the salvation of the world. The world was going to be blessed and populated through this one child. And yet God says, I want you to come and sacrifice him to me on Mount Moriah. And Abraham says, wait a minute, God, there must be some mistake. Is that what he said? No, come on, let's read it. Genesis 22, let's see what Abraham said. Let's see how he responded to this very unusual request. Abraham tested, it says. Genesis 22, beginning verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. And when he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. And then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Whew. Great story. What a wonderful story. It happened. It really happened. Today we're going to start looking at the elements of worship. And we won't have time to cover all of them today. So that's why this is going to be a 3-part series. Today we're going to look at the first 2. And then next week we'll look at the next 2. And then finally we're going to look at the 5th one. So first of all, let's look at the first element of worship. And the first element of worship is revelation. Revelation. Verse 1 and 2 point out to us that true worship is based on the revelation of God. Abraham didn't make a move till he heard from God. This episode in Abraham's life begins with God revealing himself to Abraham and speaking to him. True worship is based on that kind of revelation. Worship is not based on my likes or my dislikes. Worship is not based on my personal preferences or my priorities. It is based solely on God's revelation of himself in his word. Because true worship is based on the Bible, the only question that needs to be asked of our means of worship is this: are they biblical? Is what we're doing on Sunday morning, is it biblical? The music has to be biblical. The sermon must be biblical. The prayers must be biblical. And why is it so important that our worship be biblical? Why is that so important? Let me answer that with just a little brief story. Many of you are familiar with the great author James Missioner. And Missioner wrote a book that very few people have ever read. I don't think it was a bestseller like some of his works, but it was called The Source. And this book tells the story of a man named Erbel. And Erbel was a farmer who lived about 2200 BC. And he worshiped 2 gods. One was a god of death, and the other was a goddess of fertility. And one day the temple priests tell Erbel to bring his young son to the temple for sacrifice if he wants good crops. Erbel obeys, and on the appointed day drags his wife and boy to the scene of the boy's religious execution by fire to the god of death. And after the sacrifice of Erbel's son and several others, the priest announces that one of the fathers will spend next week in the temple with a new temple prostitute. Erbel's wife, sitting beside him, is stunned as she notices the desire written very intensely across his face. And she's overwhelmed to see him eagerly lunge forward when his name is called. The ceremony over, she walks out of the temple with her head swimming, concluding that if he had had different gods, he would have been a different man. Does that make sense? If he had had different gods, he would have been a different man. Erwin Lutzer shared this story in a little newsletter he does called Pastor to Pastor. Because the kind of God you worship is the kind of person you will become, we must make sure that the God we worship is the God of the Bible and not a God of our own making. You will become what you worship. Just as a football player must study the playbook in order to be a good player, so the worshiper must study the Bible in order to be a true worshiper. If you want to do more this Sunday than merely singing songs and listening to a preacher talk, then study the playbook. If the elements of the service are biblical and you still can't worship, maybe it's your fault. Maybe you haven't prepared properly. Which brings us to the second element, preparation. Preparation. Verse 3, I think verse 3 is very interesting. Verse 3 follows right after verse 2, right? That's not just college talk or anything. You pretty well know that. Verse 3 comes after verse 2. Verse 2, God said, take your son and sacrifice him. And verse 3, where Abraham is supposed to stand up and say, now wait a minute, God. Hold on just a second. You're talking about my only son. And you said I was going to populate the world. Now, how am I going to do that if you take my son away from me? I missed that. Does your version have that in it? Mine doesn't. Verse 3 says, early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. Preparation. That was Abraham's preparation. The revelation that Abraham received from God was hard to hear, but Abraham made preparations to obey it immediately. He got his servants together. He cut the wood for the burnt offering. He saddled his donkey. He got a knife. He took his son, and he set out for Mount Moriah. Just like Abraham, we need to make the appropriate preparation in order to worship God. If we have not prepared our hearts to worship God as well, we will not worship as we could or as we should. If we've not prepared our hearts to worship God, we will not be able to worship even if the worship service is biblical. The worship service may have all the elements that are biblical, but if we're not biblically prepared to worship, then how are we going to worship? How can we do that? When football players prepare for a game, they would do what they call, and I know other ball players do too, they do what they call get their game face on. Have you ever heard them say that? They get their game face on. And I always like to see these guys, with their faces, with the eye black and all that stuff supposed to cut down the glare and everything. That's their game face, putting their game face on. That means that they prepare themselves mentally for the challenges of the game they're about to play. And when we prepare for worship, spiritually speaking, we need to get our game faces on before we go in this sanctuary. Before we come to church, we got to have our game faces on. Let me give you an example. Deeply immersed in meditation during a church service, Italian poet Dante Alighieri failed to kneel at the appropriate moment. His enemies hurried to the bishop and demanded that Dante be punished for his sacrilege. Dante defended himself by saying, if those who accused me had had their eyes and minds on God, as I had, they too would have failed to notice events around them, and they most certainly would not have noticed what I was doing. Oh, that's called a burn on you. Like Dante, we need to get our eyes and minds on God's, because we cannot go from the secular to the sacred in a moment. We cannot pass from the world to worship at the drop of a hat. We prepared for work. Shouldn't we prepare for worship? I've seen this, and I know you have too. I've seen people come into a worship service screaming and yelling at each other, dragging the kids behind them, yelling at the kids, sit them down, and the first song they're standing up worshiping God. And I'm thinking to myself, really? I mean, you could just kind of flick a little switch and you go from parent beast mode to worship mode instantly, automatically. Ray, do you do that with Aria? Can you just go from... I bet you don't. I don't see that happening, folks. Do you see that happening? You can't just flip that switch like that. When you think about it, we spend time preparing for almost everything in life that we do. We spend time preparing for work, spend time preparing for vacations, for school, for exams, for meals. We even take time to prepare for bed, to go to sleep. How long does it take you to get ready for bed at night? We should at least spend enough time getting ready for worship as we do getting ready to go to bed at night. I'm saying at least. We may prepare to go to church. What did I say? We may prepare to go to church, but do we prepare to go to worship? We prepare for church by getting dressed in our Sunday best, fixing our hair, making sure the makeup is right, grabbing our Bibles as we head out the door. A typical Christian is very well prepared for church, but not at all prepared for worship. Abraham prepared to worship God by being obedient to the revelation of God, and then he made preparation to worship. We need to do much more than simply study the playbook. We need to do what it says. If we're going to truly worship God, we got to study the playbook. We got to get our game face on. And that takes preparation. Part of preparing to worship is to eliminate anything that distracts you from worship. And that's hard to do in the world we live in. In the mornings, I prepare for the day by doing a little devotional. Sometimes I have to fight myself to really spend time worshiping God. Now, when Brenda's at work, it's easier for me because I don't care what else is going on in the house. I don't hear anything. I don't notice anything. It's just me and God. But when she's at home, then we sit down and we do our devotional together. She does hers, I do mine. We use different versions of the Bible. She has her devotional book, I have mine. But we can sit down together in the same, I'm talking together in the same room. I'm not talking, she's not in my lap, I'm not in hers, we just sit same room. And we can do our devotional. But you have to you have to prepare. That's one reason why in the future, what I hope to do is on the Sunday, before Sunday comes, or I'd like to have some way of maybe emailing you what the title of the sermon and the scripture lesson is going to be for that day, so you can get your game face on and prepare for worship. It helps. But for the next 2 weeks, I guarantee you, what you need to do is read Genesis 22, 1 through 19 for the next 2 Sundays. Before you come into worship on Sunday, read that passage, Genesis 22, 1 through 19. And you'll be helping yourself to get prepared. And the 5 elements you want to look for, ready for these? Preparation is one. Preparation. Revelation is the first one. Revelation, preparation, separation, dedication, proclamation. Those are the 5. Got it? Sure you have that. Revelation, preparation. Next week we're going to talk about separation and dedication. And then on the 3rd week we're going to talk about proclamation. But also in the 3rd week we're going to talk about the results of true worship. What happens when we really worship? But that's all I have time for today because we got to do communion today.